The smell of iron mingled with the sour smell of sweat and oil. In the workshop, where locks and shackles were sharpened, there was a strange object, like a belt, but with loops and rings. The craftsman said it was protection from shame, but on the table nearby lay a knife with which he cut off the stuck parts when the protection wounded the one for whom it was ordered. In those years, the city lived under the rule of an aging duke, and the guards cared more about the shape of their collars than about the pain behind the stone walls of the houses. Friends, I welcome you. Your storyteller is with you. Write in the comments which city and country you are watching this episode from. I am always interested to see how far apart the stories that were once whispered in the archives have diverged. Make yourselves comfortable. Ahead is a story about how the myth of female modesty turned into metal that left burns and scars, and how one complaint changed an entire city. Enjoy listening. A woman, whose name is hidden behind initials in the documents, was admitted to the infirmary on the north side of Padua in the spring of 1483. The doctor, who was educated at the university, noted in the journal mechanical damage to soft tissues and the presence of a foreign object. No one wrote directly what the object was at the time, but later, the investigator, a clerk of the city court, left a note in the margins: a belt with buckles, having neither blessing nor legal justification. Thus began an investigation that brought together a master locksmith, a merchant, and the city court. The official statutes of those years did not recognize the concept of a chastity belt. City law contained articles on marital fidelity, marital obligations, and penalties for violence, but nothing about metal structures on the body. However, there were rumors among the people that in the northern lands, husbands locked their wives away to preserve the honor of their families. In the tavern behind the market, engravings depicting such scenes were sold, crude, like the ideas of morality themselves. People laughed at the tables, but some took these pictures seriously. It was in this laughter that the order was born. The master, whose name was Girolamo, was known not only as a blacksmith, but also as a man who knew how to make precise mechanisms, locks for chests, hinges for grills, hiding places in floors. A merchant came to him, citing concern that his wife was too free-spirited and that the family's honor was a delicate fabric that could easily be torn. The locksmith did not argue. He saw profit in the order. Within a week, he had made a device out of wrought iron, lined with soft leather on the inside. He wrote down the measurements in his notebook, as he always did, and even attached a diagram so he could repeat it for the next order. Thus, craftsmanship met superstition, and private whim met skill created for other purposes. The woman was unable to remove the device herself. After a few days, inflammation set in, followed by fever. When she was taken to the infirmary, she did not give her husband's name. She only asked for water and remained silent. The doctors removed the iron with instruments normally used to extract arrows from wounds. The local surgeon, who was required to report injuries, filed a report with the Duke's office. This brought a clerk into the case, a man accustomed to seeing both forgery and violence, but this time faced with something that even church statutes did not provide for. The investigation was conducted quietly. City statutes provided for punishment for cruel treatment, but there was no precedent for a woman's body being found under a mechanical lock. The clerk noted in the protocol, "The object does not belong to the category of clothing or tools of labor, and therefore requires consideration as a dangerous mechanism." When the craftsman was summoned for questioning, he did not deny it. He said that he had only fulfilled an order, as he had done many times before. Someone had asked for a grate for a well, someone else for a lock for a box. No one asked him about the consequences. They only asked if he had received permission for such a product. He replied that it was a private matter, unrelated to the church. With this admission, he signed his own death warrant. The clerk obtained copies of the city's decrees and found that there was no mention in the ordinances of a husband's right to use mechanical means to control his wife. Moreover, the old statutes expressly prohibited mutilation, even if committed out of jealousy. After comparing the articles, the investigator wrote, "The lack of a legal basis makes such a device illegal." But the Duke's guards were slow to act. The merchant had connections, and many considered the complaint to be a domestic misunderstanding. Only the doctor, who had seen the tissue decay with despair, insisted. Otherwise, silence would become complicity. In those years, Europe was undergoing a period of strange reforms. The Church was looking for new forms of control, and cities were establishing their own statutes in an attempt to separate themselves from the episcopal courts. Amulets against evil and curses were sold at fairs, but iron and locks were traded under the counters. Craftsmen made money on fear. The archives contain records of orders for belts of modesty, rings of repentance, and locks against sin. None of this had anything to do with official religion. On the contrary, priests condemned such inventions, calling them temptation through metal. But demand grew. Every new rumor generated a new order. When the case of Master Girolamo reached the city council, it turned out that he had made not one belt, but at least 3. One was for a wealthy shopkeeper, the second for a widower who was planning to remarry. No one wrote about this openly, but the interrogation records contained the words, "It was done out of curiosity." Thus, a shadow of vulgar entertainment, covered up with words about honor, appeared in the case. The clerk saw that it was not about morality, but about power, the power of one body over another, justified by the myth of virtue. The court archives contain the following ruling. The product is recognized as dangerous to health and morals. The craftsman is fined and deprived of the right to accept private orders. The merchant was assigned penance and temporary supervision by a priest. But the most important thing was not the punishment, but the wording. For the first time, it was documented that such constructions were neither a religious nor a legal norm. Thus, for the first time, myth collided with paper, and paper won. After the trial, the craftsman continued to live in the same neighborhood for a long time, but he received fewer orders. People avoided his shop. They said that his craft had been defiled. He stopped working with locks and took up agricultural tools. The woman who had been injured by the device disappeared from the records. Perhaps she left, perhaps she died. The doctors left only a dry line in their journals. Conditions stabilized. But it was her suffering that led the city court to include an article in the new charter prohibiting iron restraints on the body. Many centuries later, these documents will fall into the hands of historians who will argue whether such devices ever existed or whether it was all a figment of the imagination of later novelists. But the archives speak for themselves. They did exist, not as a system, but as a private fantasy born of fear and power. This is the truth of the era, not in legends of universal virtue, but in small, terrible episodes where iron touched living flesh under the pretext of morality. After the trial, the city did not immediately understand what had happened. In tavern conversations, people said that the court had punished the master for curiosity, and that now husbands could neither show strictness nor keep order in the house. But the clerk investigator saw it differently. Before him unfolded a picture of systemic disease. Where faith and law diverged, new forms of violence appeared, hidden behind words of virtue. He wrote in his report, "Morals require not iron, but reason." This document would later enter the City Chronicle as the first example of the rift between private life and public law. The Locksmiths' Guild, in order not to lose its reputation, urgently convened a meeting. The masters declared that Girolamo had acted alone, without the consent of the Brotherhood. They issued an internal decree, From now on, any order for a device that did not have a domestic or economic function had to be registered and approved by the elders. Thus, fear of punishment gave rise to bureaucracy, but this decision had consequences. A few years later, the first charter for safe craftsmanship appeared in the cities of northern Italy, which specifically stated that a blacksmith was responsible for any harm caused by his product. Thus, a personal tragedy became the source of a new legal norm. Meanwhile, church preachers used Girolamo's case as an example of carnal pride. The chronicles of the monastery of San Lorenzo contain records stating that a man who seeks purity through metal defiles the very idea of repentance. In their sermons, priests urged people not to confuse virtue with shackles. But the same monastery records contain contradictory references. Some ascetics tried to use such devices for self-control, considering them an instrument of humility. Thus, the myth lived on, like a contagion taking on a new form under the guise of piety. The Clark investigator, whose name has been preserved in the archives as Bartolomeo di Castello, continued to monitor the fate of the workshop. He saw the rumors come back to life, now in a different form. People said that there were secret workshops where belts were made for the nobility, and that the court had merely covered up the scandal so as not to upset influential landowners. The archives do not confirm this, but Bartolomeo wrote, "Lies live longer than the truth because they are not written on parchment." His diary contains descriptions of several new cases, of illegal shackles, of arbitrary vows made with the body, of attempts to prove fidelity through pain. It all sounded like an epidemic of madness caused by the fear of losing control. The doctor who filed the first complaint became, in the eyes of the townspeople, a man who had violated domestic order. He was no longer invited to wealthy homes, but he received an invitation from the university to give a lecture on mechanical injuries and moral delusions. A magistrate attended his lecture, and it was after this lecture that a clause was added to the city infirmary's charter prohibiting devices that have no therapeutic purpose but are applied to the body at the will of others. This became one of the first formulations of what centuries later would be called the right to bodily integrity. Meanwhile, similar stories were unfolding in neighboring lands. In the German principalities, iron hoops and locks were found, which later chroniclers would mistake for instruments of chastity. But upon closer examination, it turns out that most of them were parts of security mechanisms, elements of armor, or means of protection against theft. 20th century historians would argue whether chastity belts existed as a widespread practice, or whether they were all a figment of Victorian fantasies about a barbaric past. But Girolamo's case paints a different picture. Not a system, but a single obsession, a private shadow against the backdrop of a law that was then only learning to distinguish between body and property. The city archives contain records of how, after the scandal, the authorities conducted an inventory of suspicious workshops. Several blacksmiths admitted that they had heard of such orders but refused to carry them out for fear of ecclesiastical consequences. One said that the sin is not in the metal, but in the intention. The clerk noted this expression separately. His report contains a comment. This is how a new morality is born, when a craftsman feels responsible not only for the durability of the product, but also for its meaning. This conclusion would become important for the future. Decades later, similar formulations would appear in legal treatises on the duty of the craftsman and the freedom of the customer. Meanwhile, Girolamo himself lived on the outskirts, almost forgotten. He no longer forged locks, but only sharpened hoes and repaired tools for the peasants. But in his old age, as evidenced by his will, he left a surprising confession. There was no evil intent, only the fear of one man losing power over another. This short phrase, written by a hand already trembling with age, became his only justification. No one knew to whom he addressed it, to the court, to God, or to his own conscience. The city chronicles of those years also mention another side of the story: the women's gatherings that appeared after the trial. In Padua, Ferrara, and Bologna, mutual aid brotherhoods began to operate, where women were taught to read documents and write complaints. One of the statutes of such brotherhoods states, "Neither husband nor father is allowed to cause pain under the guise of honor." It was a quiet but decisive response from a society tired of justified violence. Thus, out of fear, a language of defense was born, not in public squares, but in dark rooms where people wrote with pens on scraps of paper. But along with this, a backlash arose. Men's guilds began distributing pamphlets claiming that cases involving belts were the invention of enemies of the family, that the courts were undermining order, and that women were becoming rebellious. These leaflets spread quickly, especially among guards and minor officials. Thus, the myth that the clerk had tried to destroy with his document was revived in the form of propaganda. History seemed to be going in circles. Fear led to control, control led to resistance, and resistance led to a new sermon on sin. In this closed mechanism, people remained mere details. In the fall of 1484, a year and a half after the Girolamo affair, the ducal auditor arrived in the city. He checked reports on crafts and income. In one of the items, the auditor noted, "Locksmiths and doctors operate without mutual supervision." After this order, hospitals were given the right to demand inspections of products related to the human body. This decision, dictated by fear of a new scandal, was the first step towards the emergence of sanitary inspections. Thus, a tragedy that began in a single private castle changed the structure of city government. When Bartolomeo di Castello completed his investigation, he wrote a final report, 20 pages of dense text, where each paragraph began with the words, "As a result of the case of the iron chains." He did not know that centuries later, historians would call his work the first act of civil jurisprudence in the region. For him, it was simply an attempt to put an end to the matter. In the last line of the report, he wrote, "Honor cannot be measured by a lock. Virtue does not require a key." This phrase, dry and almost bureaucratic, would become the epigraph to the city's collection of decrees, which for the first time distinguished between private power and public law. So the story that began in a dark workshop amid the smell of oil and iron was transferred to parchment, signatures, seals, and archives. But deep within that paper, something alive remained. Evidence of how human fear tried to take shape, and how the law first looked at the body, not as a thing, but as a life that could not be chained. Over the years, the case of the iron bonds dissolved into the city archives, but its echoes did not disappear. A decade later, scribes in Bologna and Milan rewrote the decrees, adding strange comments about locking up the body, which is not even permitted to a jealous man. Paper slowly turned a private case into a precedent, and a precedent into a moral example. The chronicles of that time began to use the expression iron modesty, not as a term, but as irony about excessive zeal in defending honor. Thus, a narrative was formed that later centuries would accept as the norm. Several generations later, when new forms of government took hold in Italian cities and the structure of the family began to change, this story resurfaced, this time in the writings of moralists. Writers who wanted to expose the sins of their ancestors described iron shackles as common practice. They had not seen the archives, but had heard stories retold by preachers and innkeepers. Thus, a legal curiosity gave rise to a legend. The paper that once defeated the myth became its source. One incorrect turn of phrase, one generalization, and the document became proof of something that had never existed on a large scale. In the 16th century, when waves of religious wars swept across Europe, the topic of control over the body took on a new meaning. Catholic preachers condemned the luxury and debauchery of cities, while reformers saw belts as a symbol of obscurantism. Travelers who wrote about the wonders of Italy recorded rumors in their diaries about iron belts that merchants' wives allegedly wore. In Venice, a German chronicler claimed to have seen such a device in a pharmacist's house, but described it as a relic of shame displayed as a joke. No one checked whether this was true. History lived on without witnesses. Meanwhile, the original documents on the Girolamo case lay in the city archives until the end of the 16th century. They were almost destroyed in a fire that burned down half of the ducal chancellery. Only fragments survived: a sheet signed by Bartolomeo di Castello and a line about the ban on iron chastity belts. In the following century, historians were unable to reconstruct the context. They saw only words and speculated about their meaning. The famous chronicler Girolamo Mercato wrote in his 17th century treatise on morality, "Chastity belts were introduced by decree of zealous rulers in order to preserve the purity of marriage." This is a false statement, but it became the basis for dozens of subsequent texts. The myth finally defeated the document. Since then, the image of the iron belt has become a metaphor for discipline and fear. In 17th century satirical pamphlets, it was used to ridicule jealous men, and in sermons to ridicule townswomen who sought freedom. In universities, philosophers debated whether honor could be preserved through violence. Against the backdrop of these discussions, no one remembered the real woman whose name was hidden behind the initials in the hospital register. She disappeared, leaving behind only a reason for rhetoric. The history of the body turned into the history of the text. With the advent of the 18th century, the era of anatomical theaters and new sciences about humans, Girolamo's case was revisited from a different angle. Doctors studying medieval archives found references to mechanical damage to soft tissues and took it as proof of the existence of real devices. They did not know the context and did not understand that this was an exception. Thus, scientific curiosity inadvertently reinforced the myth. Exhibitions of ancient customs began to show reconstructions of chastity belts, crude, made from imagination. Metal became a commodity again, but now for curiosity rather than power. At the same time, on the wave of anti-clerical propaganda, treatises appeared in which the Middle Ages were depicted as a prison of body and spirit. The chastity belt became a convenient symbol. It combined fear, religion, and violence in one image. Journalists and engravers spread pictures depicting women in iron rings, as if to prove the barbarism of the past. None of them had seen the original sources, but they all seemed to know the truth. At the end of the 18th century, the English pamphlet, The Shame of Locked Love, finally cemented the image of the belt as a historical fact. It was there that the phrase chastity belt first appeared in its modern sense. Bartolomeo di Castello's report had long been gathering dust in the archives, but his phrase, "honor does not require a key," now sounded like a mockery of itself. In the 19th century, when Europe was building museums and collecting artifacts, history returned to metal. Display cases were filled with items of dubious origin: locks from chests, horse armor straps, fragments of bronze armor. All of this was passed off as chastity belts. Visitors gasped, scholars argued, and journalists wrote articles about dark times. The more doubts historians expressed, the more eagerly the public believed. After all, the myth responded to a simple need: to feel freer than one's ancestors. The Middle Ages had to be made monstrous in order for their own time to seem enlightened. Sometimes, amid all these reconstructions, the name Girolamo came up, already as an anecdote. Some claimed that he was the first inventor, others that he was executed for blasphemy. Neither was true, but myths rarely die from a lack of facts. They live as long as society needs them. The chastity belt proved to be a convenient mirror. It reflected the fears of every era, from jealousy to Puritanism. At the beginning of the 20th century, when historians began to systematically check the archives, they found the case of the craftsman Girolamo and the clerk Bartolomeo. French researchers published copies of the documents and proved that there was no law on belts and that the only known case was of a private nature. But the public was no longer listening. Newspapers wrote about sensational stories, films reproduced stereotypes, and museums continued to exhibit fakes. The world was more accustomed to the myth than to the truth. And yet, there is a quiet justice in this chain of distortions. Every time someone picks up these archival pages, it becomes clear how violence is born, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The myth of iron modesty turned out to be not about women or morality, but about the anxiety of those who do not know how to trust. The documents speak more clearly about this than any sermon. There is no rhetoric in them, only facts. A wound, a report, a signature, a decree. The paper has preserved not the device itself, but the trace it left behind, on the body and in the memory. By the end of the 20th century, researchers finally acknowledged that the so-called chastity belts were a fabrication, born of rare episodes and later moralism. But their story became a metaphor for the era, how an idea can turn into metal, and metal into legend. This is the tragic irony. The attempt to lock up the body gave rise to a story from which there is no escape. When industrial exhibitions began in Europe, metal became a symbol of progress. But the more cities filled with steam and factory noise, the more society sought to separate the civilized present from its past. In this new hierarchy of memory, the myth of iron modesty proved particularly useful. At the 1851 World's Fair in London, an item labeled Italian Chastity Belt was displayed in the History of Morals Pavilion. The plaque read, "Medieval Instrument of Virtue." No one checked its origin. The item was probably made by a craftsman from Birmingham, specifically for the exhibition. But visitors saw it as proof that progress was not just technology, but liberation from barbarism. Iron, once used to instill fear, had now become a toy for morality. Victorian England, obsessed with propriety, saw these artifacts on display as confirmation of its own moral purity. Newspapers wrote about the barbaric customs of the Italians, and ladies' magazines published engravings with the caption, "How fortunate we are not to live in those times." Thus, under the guise of condemnation, a new pleasure was born, the enjoyment of someone else's darkness. The public did not see the pain, but admired its reconstruction. By the end of the 19th century, museums were competing to see whose exhibition of medieval horrors would make the strongest impression. Torture instruments were displayed in showcases, with chastity belts underneath them. Numbered labels, inventory books, and catalogs turned fakes into facts. Each exhibit was accompanied by a story based on a template: a jealous husband, a chaste wife, church approval. None of these claims were confirmed by documents, but they were the ones that sold best. People sought confirmation of their own fears in the past. Scientific societies tried to intervene. In 1897, French historian Albert Dupuy published an article entitled "On the So-Called Chastity Belts," in which he proved that all known examples were late forgeries made between the 17th and 19th centuries. He referred to the Girolamo case file, mentioning the ruling of Bartolomeo di Castello. But the publication was met with irritation rather than admiration. Newspapers accused the scholar of destroying the romance of history. The truth proved unpopular. The myth brought in money and allowed people to feel morally superior. At the same time, an entire economy grew up around this legend. Workshops in Florence and Paris made antique belts to order for collectors. In the display cases of private offices, where ancient coins and Egyptian amulets were displayed, These iron belts now hung, not as tools, but as trophies. Someone else's pain was transformed into aesthetics. Printers published brochures with stories about jealousy locks, and decadent writers used this image as a metaphor for control and desire. The myth became part of fashion. At the beginning of the 20th century, cinema picked up on this trend. The first historical films depicted the Middle Ages as a series of tortures and superstitions, and female roles were reduced to images of women locked in iron. The myth took shape on the screen. Viewers who did not have access to archives remembered precisely these images: rivets, keys, tears. Thus, the document finally gave way to spectacle. But another movement was beginning in European universities. Historians of medicine and law, armed with new methods of source criticism, returned to the original documents. They found copies of Bartolomeo's report, fragments of court records, and medical records from the Padua infirmary. By comparing dates and handwriting, scholars proved that none of the so-called belts dated back further than the 15th century, and that they were all related to private matters, not laws. In Germany, archaeologists found several exhibits that turned out to be elements of armor. Scientific journals published refutations, but popular culture was no longer listening. In the 1920s, the Museum of the History of Morris was opened in Paris, where the Chastity belt was once again displayed among the showcases, accompanied by an explanatory label, symbol of fanaticism. The exhibit was custom-made from nickel, but the description attributed it to the 15th century. Reproductions were distributed on postcards and posters. The fake continued to live on because it met expectations. People needed visual proof that the past was terrible. Thus, moral control over women became a spectacle, and moral condemnation became a commodity. Meanwhile, the original archives were kept in the university library in Bologna. Employees copied the faded documents, carefully marking the half-erased names. One of the volumes contained a note made by a librarian in the early 20th century. The case of the iron chains is an important example of how superstition gave rise to law. This simple, cold phrase sounded like a testament to history itself. In the post-war decades, when Europe was trying to come to terms with its own violence, interest in these documents flared up again. Feminist researchers saw in the myth a metaphor for control over the body and memory of it. Some believed that the story of the belt was a real page of oppression, while others believed that it was precisely the lie about it that showed how power works. Invent a threat, attribute it to the past to justify control in the present. Debates about authenticity no longer mattered. What became important was why society chose this particular image. In the 1960s, Italian archives began publishing the collection of 15th century city affairs. Among them was a Padua court ruling that mentioned the master Girolamo. The name Bartolomeo di Castello resurfaced. For the first time since the Renaissance, historians read the original words. The product is recognized as dangerous to health and morals. For archivists, this was a reminder that real history is always more subtle than legend. But the newspapers wrote differently again. The headlines read, "The original chastity belt has been found," and the articles printed a quote from Bartolomeo next to a photo of the old castle, as if he confirmed the opposite. Thus, the myth proved its vitality. It was fueled not by facts, but by the desire to see the past through fear. In the 20th century, when new forms of propaganda and mass control appeared, the image of iron on the body became relevant again, now as a symbol of totalitarian discipline. Magazines wrote about ideological belts. Artists depicted them as a metaphor for lack of freedom. History repeated itself, only the key was held by others. And yet, in the shadow of this loud memory, the archives remained, quiet as a breath after confession. In their dust lay letters, reports, lists of fines and craftsmen's certificates. The paper did not argue or prove anything, but it existed despite the noise. It testified, there was a city, there was a craftsman, there was a clerk, there was a woman, and there was a document that declared metal dangerous. Everything else was just a reflection in the glass of the display cases. Today, when European museums honestly write "Reconstruction, 19th century" on their plaques, people still stand nearby, taking pictures and sighing, as if they see evidence of someone's ancient guilt. They want to believe that barbarism is a thing of the past, that now the body belongs to the person themselves. But if you listen carefully, it becomes clear that the myth of iron modesty lives on not because someone invented it, but because it is convenient. It justifies control by turning fear into a lesson in history. The archives of Padua, Bologna, and Venice now hold thin folders where the ink is barely visible on the yellowed pages. In one of them, the signature of Bartolomeo di Castello and a note on the left are still legible. Honor does not require a key. This document is the only true voice of that history. Everything else is an echo. But it was the echo that proved louder than the paper. It traveled through the centuries, changing accents, becoming a sermon, then an anecdote, then a museum slogan. Each century added its own ring to this myth, until the very idea of freedom was framed by the image of iron. When 20th century researchers first showed copies of the documents to students, they were surprised not by the harshness of the era, but by its similarity to the present. In every system where power hides behind concern, its own chastity belt emerges. Only it is made not of metal, but of rules, fears, and regulations. Thus, Girolamo's story ceased to be local and became a mirror of human behavior. Iron, which once burned the body, became an image of any lack of freedom, legalized under the guise of morality. But there is another meaning in the archival notes, not an accusation, but a warning. The clerk did not write about a crime. He described a discrepancy between an invented duty and real law, between the desire to subjugate and the obligation to protect. His report is not a manifesto, but an attempt to do what was not yet possible, to separate personal fear from public law. This is the essence of the changes that began in those years and have not ended to this day. Over time, the concept of another man's iron on the free came to refer not to mechanisms, but to social structures. 19th century politicians used it to condemn despotism. 20th century philosophers used it to describe disciplinary societies where control is exercised gently, without keys, but with the same coldness. And each time they uttered these words, they unwittingly repeated the path of Bartolomeo, who tried to prove a simple thing. You cannot call something that causes pain morality. In the modern archive, where the original documents are stored in climate-controlled capsules, there are few visitors. Scholars studying the history of corporal punishment carefully turn the pages, seeing uneven lines, wax stains, signatures. Another short note has survived in the margins. This matter is not about honor, but about fear. These words are almost erased, but they read like a confession of the era itself. Fear was the driving force. Fear of losing power, fear of being ridiculed, fear of recognizing equality. From this fear grew castles, statutes, sermons, and legends. And yet, the story did not end in defeat. It was from this case that the concept of a master's responsibility to another's body emerged. It was on such cases that a new understanding of the law was built, when harm is determined not by intention, but by result. The doctor who filed the complaint was not seeking revenge. He demanded recognition of the fact of pain. The clerk did not construct a philosophy. He simply recorded the consequences. From these dry lines grew the future norms of medicine, law, and ethics. Thus, from tragedy was born the idea of safety, where a person is no longer a thing, but a subject. But myths die slower than people. When television returned to the theme of the Middle Ages at the end of the 20th century, images of belts, keys, and locks reappeared in documentaries. They talked about cruel traditions and showed metal objects against a backdrop of torches. None of these images had anything to do with reality, but viewers recognized something familiar in them. Thus, the modern fear, the fear of freedom, openness, trust, once again sought a form and found it in old iron. 21st century historians write differently. They do not argue about whether something happened or not. They describe why people believe, why society prefers to close its eyes to documents and look at shop windows. The answer is simple and frightening. Myth is safer. It provides a ready-made explanation and frees us from responsibility. Paper requires us to think, while metal requires us only to look. As the announcer reads these lines, somewhere in the dark vaults of Italy, safe locks click quietly, and the air smells of dusty old parchments. There lies a history that requires no faith, only attention. There are no heroes or villains in it, only people who once decided that fear could be locked away. They were wrong. Iron rusts, but fear remains until it is called by its name. And if you ask how this story ends, the answer is simple: with a document. A piece of paper that outlived the legend, and a word once written by a weary scribe, not for the sake of future centuries, but for the sake of justice. His report became the last sound of truth amid the clamor of myths, and perhaps that is why it has survived.